From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Shung, and this matters. We're all wondering about what the world will be like post-pandemic, but what if the future is in our past? The world emerges from a worldwide pandemic and warfare that has killed millions. Societies around the world are questioning long-held norms about gender, race, and culture. Big technological leaps change how and where people work. Sound familiar? It's the 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, a period marked by an explosion in the job market and mass consumerism. Jazz, flappers, Art Deco all become iconic symbols of fast-moving big cities all over the world. People wanted to live again after some bad and tough years. On This Matters, we're talking to Peter Coy, economics editor of Bloomberg Businessweek. Peter reported on how we share some similarities of life from a full century ago and how differently things are shaping up now. The case for why we might, or might not, have a roaring 20s of our own this decade. Peter, nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
So, everything that's old is new again. And before we talk about the 2020s, let's go back a century to the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. And perhaps we might mythologize it a little bit 100 years on, but this really was a decade of boom, right? Like coming out of a pandemic, this was a period of transformation.
Right. The pandemic is obviously one clear comparison. There were some differences. I mean, we're coming out of World War I. We haven't just come out of a world war. There was a deep recession that came sort of after the pandemic in 1920 and 21. And that is analogous to the recession we just came through now. And the 1920s were certainly a boom period from the point of view of technology. We had widespread adoption of the assembly line, the automobile, radio, motion pictures, indoor plumbing, labor-saving electrical appliances, refrigerators and so on, washing machines. It was culture. We had the Jazz Age, Art Deco. We had Walt Disney, Coco Chanel, on and on. The Great Gatsby, the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, as you said, it's iconic. It was a decade that acquired an adjective that everybody knows, the Roaring Twenties.
And in your reporting for Bloomberg, you explore this idea about whether we're currently headed in the same direction of another Roaring Twenties. The thinking goes, of course, that we all have cabin fever right now, you and I, everybody else listening in this pandemic. And just like the 1918-1919 pandemic, as soon as this is over, the world wants to hug again. We want to socialize. We want to talk. We want to push boundaries. Where did asking that question lead you?
First of all, let's take the upside. The upside is, hey, look, on the technological front, first of all, there are some pretty impressive technological advances. Tesla, is booming, electric vehicles, wind power, solar power, biotechnology, exemplified by the vaccines against COVID, which were developed extremely impressive at record time. Artificial intelligence. These are impressive. One of the questions is whether they can be likened to the general purpose technologies that caught on in the 1920s. So when I was talking about the automobile, for example, and assembly lines, the automobile was not created in the 1920s. It goes back to the end of the 19th century, nor was the assembly line or electrification. Electricity went back again to the end of the 19th century, but it took sort of decades for those fundamental general purpose technologies to sort of reach some sort of threshold where they became economically important, not just inventions, but changing people's lives. So the big question now is whether we are at a similar inflection point on some of these technologies, such as AI, renewable energy, and so on. The optimists say yes, the pessimists say no. To go to your other point about sort of the cabin fever, that's going to happen. I have no question about that. It's less of a game changer than the technology that we just talked about. So yeah, people will go out to restaurants more, they'll go back to the theater, they'll go to sporting events, and they'll have some spending money. Not everybody, but some of us came through the pandemic in reasonably good financial shape and were itching to blow some of our savings. But that's kind of a short-term thing. it'll boost GDP for a short while and then that'll go away. I think the bigger question is back to the one of, are you a techno-optimist or a techno-pessimist?
So the point that economists that you talk to have said, the 1920s, this was a period of manufacturing, a production boom. You mentioned again that there were already technologies in the pipeline that led to that moment of building up a labor force that put money back into people's hands again. That's part of what made the Roaring Twenties the Roaring Twenties. Is our labor market going to grow in the same way? Do we have similar things in the pipeline that would allow us to grow after this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And let's look at what happened to the labor in the 1920s is that farm prices fell. And that was devastated the agriculture sector, especially in America and Canada, because they had been supplying Europe during the war. But what happened is the European farmers recovered faster than expected. So all this extra acreage that had been planted became oversupply. So farms failed in large numbers. Now, some of those farmers ended up going into manufacturing. And so it was a boom to the manufacturing sector, which actually needed labor, the growth of all these products we've been talking about, automobiles and appliances and so on. It was a period when unemployment was pretty low. We're in a different period now because the growth sectors of the economy are not big job creators. I mean, how many people does Google have working for it? Not a lot, even though it creates a lot of value in terms of shareholder wealth and so on. And we've moved into what Larry Summers, the Harvard economist, calls sort of an asset-light economy. He's the theorist of secular stagnation, which says that we have a chronic shortage of demand in the economy and a surplus of savings, and that it's hard to correct that without sort of like government intervention to try to prop up demand. It's not the 1920s all over again, to summarize.
So in terms of how many people can be employed in the industries that are important in the 2020s, it's not the same as the economic conditions as it was in the 1920s. Those are not parallels that we can draw.
That's what I would say. And I think I'm in good company on that. I talked to a lot of big name economists. Robert Gordon at Northwestern University outside of Chicago is a famous proponent of the idea that this era does not match the era of sort of starting in the 1920s and going up to around 1973, 74. That was a period of very high productivity growth, labor productivity. Labor productivity, just as a reminder to your audience, is sort of the output and value of goods and services per hour of work. And it just grew so quickly during that period. And it slumped. It's been, 50 years now almost since then of fits and starts, but generally lower growth in productivity. I don't know if we can really say for sure that that's going to change.
We'll be right back. You mentioned it slightly earlier before, too, that, one of the enduring images of the Roaring Twenties is mass consumerism. People had money to spend, and coming out of the squalor of the pandemic and World War I, people wanted to live and spend again. In 2021, we are in a recession right now. Millions of people have lost their jobs. In the next few years, as we dig ourselves out of this, do you think that consumer confidence will be high again? Will people spend in the same way or as extravagantly as they did in the Roaring Twenties?
2 points on that. One is that we are technically not in a recession. The way the economists define a recession is a period of economic decline. So if you're at a low level, but you're actually growing, in other words, you're coming out of the pit, then that's called an expansion. So it can feel pretty bad. You can have, and we do have, high unemployment, but that's not, in economic terms, a recession.
Right. Okay.
But you're right about the general point that people have been scarred by this experience. And there's abundant evidence going back, especially a lot of us might remember our parents and grandparents who lived through the Great Depression and scrimped and saved ever after that. The imprint of having to get by with very little was so strong on them that they remained thrifty the rest of their lives. And I think there are going to be people who have gone through this who are going to remain thrifty. And they're also probably going to be a little nervous about being around other people. If you've worn a mask, if you've got that printed on your brain, some of us are going to have trouble getting that out of our brains and thinking, oh, it's fine to circulate.
Right, exactly. There is trauma here. Maybe we're being changed in ways that we don't even fully understand yet.
Right. Agree. Yeah.
You talk about this idea, and it's been written about a lot, that potentially the pandemic is a springboard into better days ahead. But is it fair to look at it that way? I mean, in the same way that we're being imprinted with what's going on right now, there are real social and economic costs to having a disease do this to a society.
I definitely don't subscribe to the springboard view that this is somehow, in a weird way, a good thing. We're going to bounce off that to better times ahead. There's been a lot of damage done. And this article in Bloomberg Businessweek tries to get into some of that. We used the word scarring a minute ago. The scarring can take many forms. There's also a lot of economic research. What happens to people who, say, graduate from college in a recession? Turns out their earnings are suppressed for years after that. Because think about it, there's a normal progression. You graduate from college or high school, you go and get your first job, and then you're on the ladder of progression after that. If you miss that first rung on the ladder, then the recession ends. The next graduating class of high school, college, those are the ones who are going to get that first set of jobs. You're going to get bypassed. And there's evidence that this actually does have a lasting effect on people. And it's hard to get back on the ladder of progression.
Right, that one generation, they can get skipped over by the next generation where things are a little bit better, that they didn't necessarily live through a pandemic or a world war that took years away from them.
Precisely, yeah. And the health effects, we've heard about the long haulers. Those are people who survived COVID-19, but continue to have some mental fog, lung problems, fatigue, and it's tragic. Those probably outnumber the people who actually died, which is a big number all by itself.
So do you think then that while there are some similarities to a situation of, again, living through a pandemic, there isn't quite the neat parallel line that we can draw our lives to now as it was in the Roaring Twenties? The conditions are different. We are different people. The society is different too.
My editor is the one who put me up to saying, hey, let's look at, is this another Roaring Twenties? And it's a great idea because it's the kind of thing that people are naturally gravitate towards reading about and thinking about. I concluded that no, it's not the same, but it was a valuable exercise to go through just to think about it. There are geopolitical aspects too we haven't even gotten into. Race was a big issue in the 1920s. On the one hand, some very positive events. There was a flowering of African-American culture. We talked about music.
The Harlem Renaissance.
And art and visual arts. And on the other hand, the Ku Klux Klan was very strong in the 1920s. There was a terrible race riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There were lynchings. A lot of Black Americans moved north from the farms to the cities to take jobs in manufacturing, the so-called Great Migration, which on the one hand helped them because higher paying jobs. On the other hand, there was backlash against them. That was a complex thing. And of course, we have a lot of racial issues we're dealing with now, although I would say overall things have improved. The issues with women are fascinating. A lot of women had gone to work in factories during World War I to replace the doughboys who had gone off to Europe. And they were expected to return to their domestic roles in the 20s, not always something they were wanting to do. On the positive side, the women in the United States gained the right to vote in 1920. Also, a lot of the new technologies were good for women, the labor-saving home appliances. Definitely a mixed picture there. I think it's fair to say it was a time of optimism and yet turmoil. There were segments of society, in particular, rural America, that yearned for was perceived to be a simpler, cleaner, past. The immigration troubled them. the feeling that, what happened to the America of old. So for some people, the change was a source of turmoil. For others, it was a source of excitement.
And even as progress marches on, it sort of comes in fits and starts. It's good in some respects, as you mentioned, for people who are historically marginalized, but it doesn't follow necessarily a straight line. Things can progress on the racial front, but that doesn't mean things are fixed in a period of 9 years, obviously.
I have a little Canadian angle. I didn't include it in my article, but I just looked it up because I knew I was coming on your show. In Canada, the 1920s were a period where there was ferment for independence from Britain. It even came down to something as simple as what side of the road to drive on.
Yeah.
British Columbia switched to driving on the right-hand side of the road. In 1922, Quebec and Ontario had already been doing that. And then the Maritime provinces joined a few years later. So that was kind of a historical shift too.
Yeah, exactly. That even in this country, things were being tossed up and people were rethinking the way maybe that we've been living, that maybe we shouldn't continue with some of those things.
Just a general feeling, it was in Europe, it was in Canada, the United States, that this was a time of change. One economist described it to me as the first truly modern decade.
So, if we look at it as something that, we can't draw a neat parallel to, well, at least probably there's some history lessons for us then. If there is something that we can learn from the Roaring Twenties in your writing and perhaps where we might be headed, what should it be? What should we embrace then? And maybe what should we be worried about as we enter the next few years?
I mentioned one other thing, which we haven't talked about yet, which was that the political side of things. The United States came out of World War I as the world's most powerful nation, and yet did not embrace the responsibilities of that role. And the League of Nations, which was going to be the body that would make sure we never had war again, couldn't get confirmation in the US Senate. And it was Woodrow Wilson's great dream. The United States insisted on that Britain and France repay their debts down to the penny, which was extremely difficult because the deflation that was going on at the time. Britain and France, in order to raise the money to pay US, started demanding reparations from Germany, which hurt Germany and caused some of the anger that led to the rise of Hitler and to World War II. So I think one thing we can learn, to answer your question, is think globally, think big picture. Another thing we can learn is that technology really does transform lives. And if we can harness it, we can live better lives. And that there are upsides from social progress for racial minorities, for women and other groups. The idea is to, I would say, understand that change is inevitable and try to embrace it and steer it rather than simply resist it.
And to your point too of maybe don't be so inward looking. Maybe right now we have to, of closing borders to contain COVID, but once this is over, maybe we shouldn't adopt isolationism and we shouldn't be so inward looking and learn from some of those lessons in the past, maybe?
Yes, agreed. But even today, I don't think we need to be, it could be that some border controls are necessary, but that doesn't mean we should be overall inward looking. And a great example of that is the COVID vaccines. The richer countries of the world are basically trying to get as many shots for themselves as possible. Africa has been largely left behind. So there are two bad things about that. The one obvious bad thing is that the Africans are more likely to die from COVID because they're not getting that protection. Even if somebody somehow did not care about that, and they should, it means there's a reservoir of COVID in which the virus can continue to mutate and send out new, potentially more harmful versions that will end up circulating in the countries that thought they had protected themselves. So even if Africa is not first on your priority list, you should think about it for your own good.
We live in a global world now.
Exactly.
Everything is a flight away from all of us.
Precisely.
Peter, it's great to talk to you. An interesting history lesson here. Thank you for your reporting and for making the time for us.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
And that is Peter Coy, economics editor of Bloomberg Businessweek. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star Newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.